When did someone violate your body without your permission? Hey, Jordan, have you seen my meds? I called out. My roommate appeared in the bathroom doorway, concerned expression perfectly in place. Which ones? My anti-rejection drugs. Half are missing. Maybe you miscounted. You've been really tired lately. I had been tired. Exhausted, actually. And the lower back pain had returned. The same dull ache I'd felt when my kidneys were failing 3 years ago. I'd attributed it to work stress, but now, I dumped out all my medications on the counter. The prednisone bottle felt light too. The mycophenolate was nearly gone. These weren't controlled substances someone would steal to sell. These were the specific drugs keeping my transplanted kidney functioning. I'm calling my doctor, I said, hands shaking as I dialed. Don't you think you're overreacting? Jordan touched my shoulder. You've been taking double doses sometimes when you feel bad. I've seen you. No, I haven't. These dosages are exact. If I take too much or too little, the kidney rejects. I know. You've told me 100 times. There was something in Jordan's tone I'd never noticed before. A subtle irritation. Dr. Garcia wanted me to come in immediately when I explained. My last blood work had shown concerning changes in my creatine levels. She'd assumed I'd been non-compliant with my medications. Now we both suspected something worse. While Jordan was in class, I tore apart our apartment. The search started innocently enough, checking shared spaces, the kitchen drawers where pills sometimes got mixed up. But as my desperation grew, I found myself in Jordan's room. That's where everything unraveled. In Jordan's sock drawer, hidden beneath neatly folded pairs, I found them. My pills, sorted into daily vitamin organizers. But something was wrong. The weight felt off. With trembling fingers, I opened one of the capsules and tasted the powder. Sugar. My roommate had been replacing my anti-rejection medications with sugar pills. But there was more. A laptop open on the desk, camera positioned to record the common areas. Files labeled Subject 4, Daily Observations. Videos of me taking my fake medications. Photos documenting my declining health. Spreadsheets tracking every symptom with clinical precision. Timestamps showed Jordan had been recording me for months, long before the medication swap. There were notes about my sleep patterns, eating habits, mood changes. Every aspect of my deterioration was meticulously cataloged. And at the bottom of the drawer, 3 other folders. Subject 1, diabetes. Subject 2, epilepsy. Subject 3, heart disease, deceased. I wasn't Jordan's first victim. My hands shook as I opened the folders. Each contained similar documentation. Photos of unsuspecting roommates. Medical histories obtained through careful questioning disguised as friendly concern. Detailed notes on medication schedules. And in each case, the same pattern. Gradual substitution of life-saving medications with placebos, careful observation of the decline, clinical documentation of the results. Subject 3's folder was the thickest. The final entry simply read, cardiac arrest achieved on day 73. Subject expired before emergency services arrived. Thesis committee impressed with thoroughness of data. I called 911, told them I needed immediate transport to the hospital. My transplant coordinator would need to start emergency intervention. Without consistent immunosuppression, my body had likely already begun attacking the kidney. I grabbed the laptop and folders as evidence, my body already feeling the weight of 2 months without proper medication. Jordan came home as the paramedics were loading me into the ambulance. The timing seemed too convenient, as if somehow Jordan knew I'd discovered everything. What happened? Are you okay? The perfect concerned roommate act. The same performance I now realized had been carefully crafted from day one. You've been switching my pills. I held up the vitamin organizer. How long? Jordan's face went through several expressions before settling on defiance. No more pretense. No more fake concern. Just cold, scientific detachment. 2 months. And look at you. You're fine. Better than fine. You don't need all those toxic chemicals. I have a transplanted kidney. Those toxic chemicals keep me alive. No, they keep you dependent. Weak. I've been documenting everything for my biochemistry thesis. How the medical industry creates lifetime customers through psychological dependence. The paramedic was already starting an IV. My blood pressure was rising, chest tight, classic signs of organ rejection. I could feel my body attacking the kidney that had given me 3 years of normal life. Your thesis? I couldn't process the betrayal. I was proving you don't need them, that your body could adapt naturally. My professor says it's groundbreaking research, and you're only subject number 4. Your little sister in subject number 5. She just doesn't know it yet. The paramedic slammed the ambulance doors shut, and we pulled away from the curb. I watched through the back window as Jordan stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, that same cold expression on her face. The other paramedic kept checking my blood pressure every few minutes. The numbers kept climbing. My chest felt tight and my back ached with that deep, familiar pain I remembered from before the transplant. The fourth line in my arm pulled slightly as we hit a bump. I clutched the laptop and folders against my chest with my free hand. This was evidence, proof of what Jordan had done to me and 3 other people. The paramedic asked if I was having trouble breathing. I nodded. He adjusted the oxygen mask on my face and told me we were almost there. The siren wailed above us as we sped through traffic. My mind kept racing back to Subject 3's folder. Cardiac arrest achieved on day 73. Someone died because of Jordan's experiment. Someone's family lost them, and I could have been next. The ambulance jerked to a stop, and the back doors flew open. Bright lights flooded in from the emergency department entrance. The paramedics pulled the stretcher out and wheeled me through automatic doors into a chaos of beeping machines and rushing people. Dr. Garcia was already there waiting, her face tight with worry. She grabbed the rail of my stretcher as they rolled me past. Her eyes went to the laptop and folders I was holding, then to the pill organizer the paramedic handed her. She opened one of the capsules, tasted the powder, and her face went completely white. She started shouting orders to the nurses around us. High-dose intravenous steroids, stat, full metabolic panel, type and cross. Get the transplant team down here now. They wheeled me into a bay, and suddenly there were hands everywhere. Nurses cutting off my shirt, sticking electrode pads on my chest, wrapping a blood pressure cuff around my arm. One nurse started a second IV line in my other arm, while another one began drawing blood. Tube after tube after tube. The phlebotomist filled what looked like a dozen vials. Someone asked me questions while all this was happening. A police officer stood at the foot of my bed with a notepad. He wanted to know what happened. I tried to explain through the oxygen mask. Found my roommate switching my medications. Sugar pills instead of anti-rejection drugs. 2 months without the real medicine. Found files on 3 other victims. Hidden cameras recording me. The officer's expression changed as I talked. His jaw got tight. He asked me to repeat what I said about the other victims. I pointed to the folders on the bed beside me. Subject 1 through Subject 3. All roommates. All had their medications switched. Subject 3 died. The officer picked up the folders carefully, like they might break. He flipped through Subject 3's file and stopped at the last page. His face went hard. He stepped out of the bay, and I heard him on his radio calling for a detective. Dr. Garcia came back about 20 minutes later with a tablet in her hands. She pulled up a chair next to my bed, and her jaw was clenched as she looked at the screen. She showed me the numbers. My creatinine had more than doubled since my last check 3 months ago. My kidney function was down to 30%. She explained that 2 months without immunosuppression had triggered acute cellular rejection. My immune system was attacking the transplant. We needed to act fast and hard to save it before the damage became permanent. She was already starting me on pulse-dose steroids through the IV. The medicine burned going in. A detective arrived within an hour. Detective Bradshaw was tall with gray hair and tired eyes. He set up in a private consultation room down the hall, and a nurse wheeled me there, still hooked to my IV pole. He asked me to walk him through everything from the beginning. I started with noticing my pills going missing a few weeks ago, the exhaustion and back pain getting worse, finding the sugar pills in Jordan's room, the surveillance equipment, the files documenting my decline with dates and symptoms and photos. He took pictures of everything with his phone, the pill organizer with the fake medications, each of the victim folders spread out on the table, the spreadsheets showing how Jordan tracked every aspect of my deterioration. He spent extra time photographing Subject 3's folder and that final entry about cardiac arrest. Vanessa Courtney came in while we were still going through everything. She's the transplant coordinator, and she'd worked with me since before my surgery 3 years ago. She pulled up a chair and explained the treatment plan while Bradshaw kept taking notes. The pulse-dose steroids were already running. If my kidney didn't respond in 48 hours, we'd need to do plasmapheresis. That meant hooking me up to a machine that would filter my blood to remove the antibodies attacking my kidney. She was honest about the risks. Even with aggressive treatment, I might have permanent damage to my kidney function. Some of the harm might be irreversible. Sitting there listening to her explain how my body was destroying the organ that had given me 3 years of normal life, I suddenly remembered Jordan's last words. "Your little sister is subject number 5. Panic hit me like a physical blow. My hands started shaking so badly I couldn't hold the cup of water the nurse had given me. I tried to tell Bradshaw about my sister, but I couldn't get the words out. He saw my face and asked what was wrong. I finally managed to explain that Jordan had threatened my sister, said she was the next victim. Bradshaw immediately pulled out his phone and called dispatch. He gave them my sister's address 3 hours away and told them to send officers to check on her and secure any medications they found. A nurse had to help me dial Sanjay's number because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. He answered on the second ring. I tried to explain what was happening, but the words came out jumbled. Jordan switched my pills. I'm in the hospital. My kidney is rejecting. She killed someone. She's going after our sister. Sanjay said he was leaving work right now. He'd be there as fast as he could drive. Sanjay showed up around 7 that evening. He must have driven like crazy to get there that fast. His tie was loose and his shirt was wrinkled like he'd just walked out of a meeting. He came into my room and stopped when he saw all the IV lines and monitors. His face went through about 5 different emotions before settling on anger. He started pacing back and forth, asking how someone could do this. How could Jordan live with me for months and pretend to care while she was slowly poisoning me? When Bradshaw came back to ask more questions, Sanjay pulled a chair up next to my bed and took out a notepad. He wrote down everything the detective said: names, badge numbers, case numbers, next steps. He transformed his anger into something useful. The first night was awful. The high-dose steroids hit my system hard. My heart raced. I felt wired and exhausted at the same time. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I saw Jordan's face. That cold, scientific expression when she admitted what she'd done. I kept thinking about all the times she'd watched me take those fake pills. All the times she'd asked how I was feeling, pretending to care, when she was really just collecting data. How many videos did she have of me taking sugar pills while my kidney slowly started to fail? Dr. Garcia came by early the next morning. She sat on the edge of my bed and explained that they needed to do a kidney biopsy. They'd insert a needle through my back to take small tissue samples from the transplant. It would hurt, and there were risks, but we needed to know exactly how much damage the rejection had caused. That would tell us what kind of treatment approach to take going forward. Bradshaw showed up around 9 with an update. Officers had found my sister safe at her apartment, but they'd also found something disturbing. Her vitamins had been replaced with sugar pills just like mine. Apparently, Jordan had befriended her during family visits over the past few months. Last month, she'd offered to help organize her supplements into daily containers. My sister was shaken, but okay. Vitamins weren't life-saving medications like my anti-rejection drugs. She'd been moved to stay with friends while the investigation continued. Bradshaw said they were expanding the case. This wasn't just about me anymore. They were looking at everyone Jordan had contact with over the past few years. A woman knocked on my door around lunchtime the next day. She introduced herself as Rita from the hospital social work department. She pulled up a chair next to my bed and asked how I was holding up with everything. I didn't really know how to answer that question. My roommate had been slowly killing me for 2 months while taking notes. Rita nodded like she understood. She told me she'd worked with cases of medical abuse before. What Jordan did wasn't just a roommate problem or a misunderstanding. It was a serious crime. Hearing someone say that out loud helped somehow. Rita explained that the feelings I was having were normal. The betrayal, the violation, the anger, the confusion about how I missed the signs. She gave me information about a victim advocate who worked specifically with cases involving medical harm. His name was Javier Solis, and he'd be reaching out soon. Rita left her card and told me to call any time. Dr. Garcia came by after lunch to go over the biopsy procedure again. It was scheduled for that afternoon. She walked me through exactly what would happen. I'd lie on my stomach while they used ultrasound to guide a needle through my back into the transplanted kidney. They'd take several tissue samples to see how bad the rejection was. It would hurt, and I'd need to stay completely still. There were risks like bleeding or damage to the kidney, but we needed to know what we were dealing with. Sanjay showed up right before they took me down for the procedure. He squeezed my hand and told me he'd be waiting when I got back. The procedure room was cold. They had me lie face down on the table with my arms above my head. The ultrasound technician moved the wand around on my back to find the kidney. Then the doctor numbed the area with local pain medicine. That part stung. The actual biopsy needle felt like intense pressure, like someone pushing hard on a bruise. I had to hold my breath while they inserted it. The sound of the needle clicking as it took samples made my stomach turn. They did it 3 times to get enough tissue. Sanjay held my hand the whole time like he promised. I focused on breathing and counting in my head. Afterward, they made me lie flat on my back for 4 hours to prevent bleeding. Detective Bradshaw showed up during my bed rest with a guy he introduced as a forensic technician. They needed to examine Jordan's laptop more carefully. I watched them work from my hospital bed. The technician pulled up file after file, clicking through folders and checking timestamps. His face got more serious as he dug deeper. He told Bradshaw the surveillance footage went back 8 months, not just 2. Jordan had been recording me since the day I moved in. The files showed months of normal routine documentation before she started switching my medications. She'd tracked when I took my pills, what I ate, when I slept, who I talked to, everything. There were notes about my habits and patterns. She'd studied me like a lab rat for half a year before beginning her experiment. The technician said he'd never seen anything this planned out. Most crimes had some chaos to them, but this was organized like a real research project. He copied everything onto evidence drives while I lay there trying to process that Jordan had been watching me for 8 months. Dr. Garcia came back that evening with my biopsy results. She said they'd marked them urgent, so the pathology lab rushed them through. Her face told me the news wasn't good before she even started talking. I had acute cellular rejection, which they expected, but I also had early signs of antibody-mediated rejection, which was more serious. The tissue samples showed a lot of inflammation. There was also some scarring that meant parts of my kidney had already been permanently damaged. The longer I went without proper medication, the more damage happened. 2 months was a long time. Dr. Garcia sat down with me and Sanjay to talk about next steps. The high-dose steroids I'd been getting weren't enough on their own. We needed to move to something called plasmapheresis. She explained it was like dialysis, but different. A machine would filter my blood to remove the antibodies that were attacking my kidney. It would buy time for the immunosuppression drugs to work. I'd need treatments every other day for at least 2 weeks. Each treatment took about 4 hours. Sanjay asked about side effects and long-term outlook. Dr. Garcia was honest. Even with aggressive treatment, my kidney function might never get back to where it was before. Some of the damage was already done. We were trying to save what we could. A man named Javier Solis stopped by that evening. He was from the Victim Advocacy Office. He shook my hand and pulled up a chair. His voice was calm and steady. He walked me through what would happen with the criminal investigation. With multiple victims and 1 death, the district attorney's office would prosecute this hard. But the legal process took time. Months, maybe years. There would be court dates and hearings. I'd probably have to testify. Javier explained he'd be there to help me through all of it. He'd go to court with me, explain procedures, connect me with resources. He gave me his direct number and told me to call any time, day or night. Detective Bradshaw came back later with news that made my chest tight. They'd contacted the family of Subject 3, the heart disease patient who died. The case was reopened as a possible homicide. The original death certificate said natural causes from his existing heart condition, but Jordan's files showed she'd deliberately withheld his medications and documented his decline until he had a fatal heart attack. The medical examiner was reviewing everything. If they could prove she caused his death by withholding medication, she'd face murder charges. My phone rang around 8. It was Lewis Porter from University Housing. He apologized about 5 times in the first minute. Jordan had been banned from campus while the investigation continued. They were arranging to move all my stuff out of our shared apartment into secure storage. He asked if there was anything specific I needed right away. I told him about my laptop and some clothes. Lewis promised they'd handle everything carefully and document it all. He kept saying how sorry he was and how seriously the university was taking this. I could tell he was worried about lawsuits. He assured me they were cooperating fully with the police. My first plasmapheresis treatment happened the next morning. A nurse wheeled me down to a special unit. The machine looked like a bigger version of a dialysis setup. They put in 2 IV lines, one to take blood out and one to return it. The machine pulled my blood through, separated out the plasma that had the bad antibodies, and put the blood back with replacement plasma. It took almost 4 hours. I felt weird the whole time, like my blood wasn't quite mine anymore. Afterward, I was exhausted and shaky. They made me drink extra fluids and monitored my blood pressure for an hour before taking me back to my room. Between treatments over the next few days, Sanjay and I started going through the evidence files more carefully. We sat with the laptop and clicked through everything. That's when we found the emails. Jordan had been writing to her biochemistry professor about her research. The emails were careful, never saying exactly what she was doing, but the professor's responses encouraged her work. He praised her dedication to challenging conventional medical ideas. He wrote about how important it was to question whether people really needed all the medications doctors prescribed. The emails made it clear he knew something was going on, even if he didn't admit it directly. Sanjay took screenshots of everything and forwarded them to Detective Bradshaw. Detective Bradshaw showed up the next morning with someone new. He introduced the woman as Siobhan McPherson from the district attorney's office. She shook my hand carefully, like she knew I was fragile, then pulled a chair close to my hospital bed. Her questions were different from the detective's. She asked about specific things Jordan said, especially the part about proving people don't need medications. She wrote down every detail about the thesis comment and the professor's encouragement. She wanted to know exactly how Jordan described creating lifetime customers and the medical industry keeping people dependent. I repeated everything I could remember from that awful moment in the ambulance. She nodded a lot and made notes in a leather folder. When she left after almost 2 hours, she told Detective Bradshaw she had enough to move forward with serious charges. Dr. Garcia came by that afternoon with my latest lab results. She pulled up a chair and opened her tablet to show me the numbers. My creatinine had dropped from where it was when I first got admitted. Not back to normal, but better. She explained that after 3 rounds of plasmapheresis, my kidney was responding to treatment. The inflammation markers were down too. But then she got quiet for a second before telling me the hard part. My kidney function was sitting around 40% of what it used to be. The damage from 2 months without proper immunosuppression had left permanent scarring in some areas. She said we'd keep monitoring closely, but I needed to understand that this might be my new normal. Some of what Jordan did couldn't be undone. The forensic technician came back later with Detective Bradshaw. They'd finished going through every file on Jordan's laptop. What they found made the whole thing even worse. Jordan had been active in online groups that pushed conspiracy theories about medications. These weren't just random internet comments. She'd been posting for over a year in forums where people convinced each other that prescription drugs were unnecessary and dangerous. The posts showed her getting more and more extreme over time. She wrote about wanting to prove that pharmaceutical companies created fake dependencies to make money. She talked about conducting research to expose the truth. Other people in these groups encouraged her and praised her dedication. The technician showed me screenshots of posts where Jordan described her plans in vague terms and other users cheered her on. Detective Bradshaw asked if I wanted to speak with one of the other victims. He said a woman named Cleo Takahashi had reached out asking to talk to me. She was subject 1, the diabetes patient from the first folder. I said yes immediately. We set up a phone call for that evening. When Cleo's voice came through the speaker, it was shaky at first. She told me about living with Jordan 2 years ago, about how her blood sugar kept spiking no matter what she did, about ending up in the emergency room in diabetic ketoacidosis, so sick she almost died. The doctors couldn't figure out why her insulin wasn't working until they tested it and found saline instead, but they never knew who switched it. She'd suspected her roommate but had no proof. Now she finally knew for sure. We talked for over an hour. She understood things nobody else could. The specific violation of having someone you trusted poison you slowly while pretending to care. By the end of the call, we'd exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch. The university called 2 days later, asking me to give a statement to their conduct board. I had to meet with 3 administrators in a conference room on campus. Sanjay came with me. The whole process felt slow and weird compared to the police investigation. They asked careful questions and took notes on official forms, but I could tell they were more worried about protecting the university than actually dealing with what happened. They kept asking about housing procedures and whether I'd reported any concerns before finding the evidence. One of them mentioned multiple times how seriously they took student safety. It felt like they were already thinking about lawsuits instead of about how a student was able to run experiments on roommates for years without anyone noticing. Sanjay had been staying at the hospital almost constantly for 2 weeks, but he had to go back to work eventually. He'd arranged things with his boss to work remotely part-time so he could stay in town. Every evening before he left my room, we'd sit down with my phone calendar and go through the next day's schedule together. Medical appointments, legal meetings, insurance calls. He wrote everything down in a notebook too, just in case. Having him there kept me from feeling totally lost in all the paperwork and procedures. He knew when to push back on doctors and when to just listen. He dealt with insurance companies when I was too tired. I don't know how I would have managed any of it alone. Ada McPherson filed formal charges against Jordan 3 days later. Detective Bradshaw called to tell me. Assault, reckless endangerment, and practicing medicine without a license. She explained they were still building the case for homicide charges related to Subject 3, but these charges were enough to keep Jordan locked up. The bail got set at $500,000. McPherson told Detective Bradshaw that given the danger Jordan posed to others, she'd argued for the high amount. The judge agreed. Knowing Jordan couldn't get out made me feel a little safer, but it didn't erase the damage she'd already done. After 2 full weeks of treatment, Dr. Garcia finally said I could go home. She handed me a thick packet of instructions for follow-up care. My kidney function had improved to about 50%, which was better than she'd feared, but still way below where I'd been before Jordan started tampering. I'd need to come back twice a week for lab work and monitoring. My immunosuppression regimen was different now, higher doses to try to protect what function I had left. She was honest that there were no guarantees. The function could drop again. I might need another transplant eventually. But for now, I was stable enough to leave the hospital. The housing situation became urgent once discharge was set. I couldn't go back to the apartment I'd shared with Jordan. Lewis Porter from University Housing called to discuss options. They had a single room available in a different building, but it wouldn't be ready for another week. He apologized repeatedly and promised they'd move my stuff from the old apartment into secure storage. Before I could even figure out where I'd stay in the meantime, Sanjay jumped in. He said I should stay with him. He had a guest room. It made sense. We started making arrangements to get my belongings from storage delivered to his place instead. Moving into Sanjay's apartment felt strange. Good strange, but strange. I was grateful to be somewhere safe where I didn't have to worry about Jordan showing up, but I also felt like I was disrupting his whole life. He'd been living alone, and now suddenly had his sick brother taking over his guest room. When I tried to apologize for being a burden, he shut me down immediately. He'd already set up the guest room with everything I might need. Clean sheets, extra pillows, a lamp for reading, and in the corner, a small safe with a combination lock. He handed me the paper with the code and told me I was the only one who'd know it. I could keep my medications locked up where only I had access. Looking at that safe made me feel protected and sad at the same time. It was good to have that security, but it hurt that I needed it at all. 2 days later, Detective Bradshaw called while I was organizing my medications in the safe. He had news that made the whole situation feel even bigger and scarier than it already was. 2 more people had come forward after reading about Jordan's arrest in the university newspaper. Both were former roommates from years ago, back before she'd even started the biochemistry program. They'd lived with her during her undergraduate years, and both remembered getting sick while living together, though neither could prove anything concrete. One woman said her asthma got way worse, and she ended up in the hospital twice. The other guy mentioned weird stomach problems that cleared up right after he moved out. Neither had documentation like the 4 confirmed victims, no hidden files or surveillance footage, but the pattern was there. Jordan had been doing this for at least 5 years, maybe longer. The detective wanted me to know because it showed this wasn't some recent thing she'd started for a thesis. This was who she was. I thanked him for calling and hung up feeling sick. How many people had Jordan hurt over the years? How many had she practiced on before perfecting her method with me and the others? My first outpatient appointment with Dr. Garcia happened 3 days after moving into Sanjay's place. I'd been taking my medications religiously from the safe, never missing a dose, always at the exact right times. The blood work came back while I sat in her office, and I could tell from her face it wasn't good news. My kidney function had dropped to 45%. Not a huge drop from the 50% I'd been at in the hospital, but still going the wrong direction. She pulled up charts on her computer and showed me the trend line. My creatinine was creeping up again despite the high-dose immunosuppression. She used the term chronic rejection and explained that even with treatment, the damage from those 2 months without proper medications might keep getting worse. We might be able to slow it down, maybe even stop it, but there was a real chance I'd need another transplant eventually. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My first transplant took 3 years of dialysis before finding a match. 3 years of being hooked up to a machine 4 hours a day, 3 days a week. 3 years of feeling exhausted and sick and limited. I'd finally gotten my life back with this kidney, and now Jordan had stolen that from me. Dr. Garcia saw my face and reached across the desk to squeeze my hand. She wasn't giving up on this kidney yet, she said. We'd fight for every bit of function we could save, but I needed to be prepared for the possibility of going back on dialysis someday. Javier from Victim Services called that afternoon. He'd been checking in regularly since the hospital, making sure I had everything I needed for the legal process. This time, he had a specific recommendation. He knew a therapist named Paulina Flores, who specialized in trauma from medical abuse and betrayal. She'd worked with survivors of Munchausen by proxy, with people whose doctors or nurses had hurt them, with cases like mine where someone used medical knowledge to harm. Javier thought I should talk to her, because what Jordan did wasn't just assault. It was a specific kind of violation that needed specialized help to process. I agreed to try it, even though I wasn't sure what talking would accomplish. My kidney was still damaged, no matter how much therapy I got. But Javier set up the appointment for the following week. The first session with Paulina was harder than I expected. Her office was small and comfortable with soft lighting and a couch that didn't feel too much like a stereotypical therapy setup. She asked me to tell her what happened, and I started with finding the sugar pills in Jordan's room. But she stopped me and asked me to go back further. When did Jordan and I become roommates? How did we meet? What was our relationship like before I discovered the tampering? So I talked about how Jordan had seemed like the perfect roommate at first. Concerned about my health, always asking if I'd taken my medications, offering to pick up prescriptions when I was tired. I talked about how she'd seemed genuinely interested in my transplant story, asking detailed questions about the surgery and recovery and medication regimen. And that's when it hit me during the session. Every single thing I'd interpreted as Jordan caring about me had actually been her gathering information for her experiment. Every concerned question had been researched. Every offer to help had been getting closer to my medications. Paulina watched me work through this realization and then said something that made sense of the whole terrible thing. The psychological damage was just as real as the physical harm to my kidney. Jordan had weaponized trust and care, turning the basic human need for connection into a tool for harm. That violation of trust, that betrayal of the roommate relationship, that was its own kind of injury that needed healing. Cleo Takahashi and I had been texting since Detective Bradshaw connected us, but we finally met in person 2 weeks after my first therapy session. We picked a coffee shop halfway between our cities, about an hour drive for each of us. I got there first and sat at a corner table, nervous about meeting someone who'd been through the same thing I had. When she walked in, I recognized her immediately from the photo Detective Bradshaw had shown me. She was tall and thin, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she looked tired in a way I understood completely. We hugged without saying anything first, just this immediate connection between two people who'd survived the same predator. Then we sat down and started comparing notes. The similarities were stunning and horrible. Jordan had used the exact same approach with both of us. The Concerned Roommate Act, asking detailed questions about our medical conditions, offering to help organize medications. With Cleo, it had been insulin for her diabetes. Jordan had gradually replaced the insulin with saline over several weeks, carefully documenting Cleo's rising blood sugar and increasing symptoms. Cleo ended up in the hospital with diabetic ketoacidosis, nearly dying before doctors figured out her insulin had been tampered with. But she'd never known who did it until Detective Bradshaw contacted her about my case. We spent 3 hours in that coffee shop, talking through every detail of how Jordan had operated. The surveillance footage, the clinical documentation, the cold scientific way she'd watched us suffer. And when we were confronted, that same detached expression, like we were lab rats instead of people. Having someone who truly understood what I'd been through, who'd felt that same betrayal and violation, was more healing than I'd expected. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch. Neither of us had to explain to the other why we needed to keep our medications locked up now or why we had trouble trusting people. We just knew. The university's investigation wrapped up about 3 weeks after my discharge from the hospital. Lewis Porter from housing called to tell me the results before they were officially released. Jordan was expelled and banned from campus permanently. Her student records would be flagged, so she couldn't transfer the credits to another school. The biochemistry department was conducting its own review of her professor's role in encouraging her research. But when I asked Lewis about the actual report, about whether it addressed how Jordan had been able to do this to multiple roommates over several years without anyone noticing, he got quiet. The report was frustratingly vague about institutional accountability. There was no mention of how her professor's encouragement had enabled the experiments. Nothing about how the housing system had failed to notice warning signs when multiple roommates reported health problems. Just a lot of language about taking the matter seriously and implementing new protocols going forward. Lewis admitted quietly that the university's lawyers had heavily edited the findings. They were worried about liability, about lawsuits from the victims. The report was designed to show the university taking action while avoiding any admission that they should have caught this sooner. I thanked him for being honest with me and hung up feeling frustrated. Jordan was being held accountable, but the system that had allowed her to operate for years was protecting itself. Ada McPherson called a few days after the university report came out. She wanted to discuss the timeline for the criminal case and prepare me for what was coming. With multiple victims and complex medical evidence, building the prosecution was going to take months. She was confident about getting convictions on the current charges of assault, reckless endangerment, and practicing medicine without a license. The evidence was overwhelming between the laptop files, the surveillance footage, and the testimony from multiple victims. But she was still working with the medical examiner on the case for Subject 3, trying to prove that Jordan's medication tampering had directly caused the cardiac arrest that killed him. If they could establish that connection definitively, they'd upgrade to homicide charges. That would mean a much longer sentence, potentially decades in prison instead of just years. She warned me that the whole process would likely take at least 6 months before trial, maybe longer. There would be depositions, more evidence gathering, pre-trial motions. I needed to be patient and trust that they were building the strongest case possible. She also mentioned that Jordan's defense attorney had already started trying to create doubt, suggesting that victims might have been non-compliant with medications on their own. It was garbage, and the evidence proved it, but I should be prepared for them to try that angle. Javier suggested I try a support group for people who'd experienced medical abuse. I was hesitant at first because I'd never been much of a group therapy person, but he said it might help to hear from others who'd been through similar things. The group met Tuesday evenings in a community center downtown. When I walked in the first time, there were about 8 people sitting in a circle of chairs. The facilitator introduced me and explained that the group included survivors of Munchausen by proxy, medication tampering, and healthcare provider misconduct. We went around the circle sharing our stories. One woman's mother had made her sick throughout her childhood to get attention from doctors. A man's nurse had been stealing his pain medications and replacing them with Tylenol during his cancer treatment. Another woman's psychiatrist had been overprescribing medications to keep her dependent and compliant. Each story was different, but there was this common thread of medical knowledge being used as a weapon, of trust being violated in the context of healthcare. When it was my turn, I told them about Jordan and the sugar pills and my failing kidney. After the meeting, several people came up to tell me they understood, that they knew what it felt like to have your body used as someone else's experiment or tool. And weirdly, I found myself offering support to the newer members who were earlier in their recovery. I'd only been dealing with this for a few weeks, but I'd already learned things about navigating the legal system and managing medical trauma that might help them. The group became a regular part of my week. 3 months after the initial crisis, I had another appointment with Dr. Garcia for comprehensive testing. The waiting room felt familiar now in a way I hated. I'd been there so many times in the past few months. They drew blood, collected urine samples, did an ultrasound of the kidney. Then I sat in her office while she pulled up the results. My kidney function had stabilized at 42%. It had dropped another 3% from the last check, but then stopped declining. She pulled up the trend line again and showed me that the past month had been flat. No improvement, but also no further damage. She was cautiously hopeful that we'd reached a new baseline. The kidney had sustained permanent damage from those 2 months without proper immunosuppression, but it seemed to have stabilized at this lower level of function. She was honest that this meant I was living with chronic kidney disease again. Stage 3, specifically. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I'd need to be more careful about my health than I'd been when the kidney was functioning at 80%. Watch my diet more closely, stay hydrated, avoid medications that could stress the kidney further. But it was manageable. I wasn't looking at immediate dialysis. We'd keep monitoring closely, monthly blood work for now, but if things stayed stable, we might be able to spread out the appointments eventually. I left her office feeling a complicated mix of relief and grief. Relief that the decline had stopped. Grief for the 40% of kidney function I'd lost. For the freedom and health I'd had before Jordan decided to use me as a lab rat. Detective Bradshaw called again a week after that appointment with news that made the whole case even bigger. The forensic accountants had been digging through Jordan's financial records and her professor's research accounts. They'd found something significant. Jordan had been receiving monthly payments from her professor's research grant. Not a lot, maybe $500 a month, but regular deposits labeled as research assistant stipend. The payments had started around the same time she'd begun tampering with my medications. Essentially, she'd been getting paid to conduct her illegal experiments. The professor had funded her work, even though he had to have known what she was doing. The carefully worded emails suddenly made more sense. He'd been maintaining plausible deniability while actively supporting her research with money. This opened up potential charges against the professor for conspiracy and research misconduct. It also meant the university was facing serious liability questions. They'd been paying grant money that funded illegal human experimentation on students. Detective Bradshaw said the investigation was expanding, and I might need to give additional statements about any interactions I'd had with the professor. I'd met him once when Jordan brought me to a department event, but I didn't remember much about the conversation. Still, every detail might matter now. Ada McPherson called to schedule a meeting to prepare for the preliminary hearing, which was set for next month. She wanted to review everything in detail, so I'd be ready to testify. We met at her office downtown, a small room with stacks of files and a whiteboard covered in timeline notes. She walked me through the entire sequence of events, asking me to explain each piece. When did I first notice the medications going missing? What symptoms did I experience? How did I discover the sugar pills? What did I find on Jordan's laptop? She took notes on everything, occasionally stopping to clarify details or ask follow-up questions. Then she explained what to expect from Jordan's defense attorney. They were going to try to argue that I'd been non-compliant with my medications on my own, that maybe I'd been confused or forgetful due to the side effects of immunosuppression. It was a weak argument given the surveillance footage and Jordan's own documentation, but they'd try it anyway. She coached me on how to stay calm during cross-examination, how to stick to the facts, how to not let them rattle me. The evidence was overwhelming, she kept saying. The laptop files alone were damning, but I needed to be prepared for them to try to make me doubt myself or seem unreliable. We spent 2 hours going over potential questions and practicing my responses. By the end, I felt more prepared, but also exhausted from reliving everything in such detail. Back at Sanjay's apartment, we fell into a pattern over the next few weeks that made both of us feel more normal. He set up his laptop at the kitchen table every morning and worked from home while I went to my appointments with Dr. Garcia, Paulina, or the various specialists managing my recovery. We'd meet back at the apartment around 5 and cook dinner together, trying new recipes from a cookbook his girlfriend had given him. The routine helped me feel less like a burden and more like I was contributing something, even if it was just chopping vegetables or setting the table. Paulina and I talked a lot about independence during our sessions, about how easy it would be to lean too hard on Sanjay's support and lose the progress I'd made in learning to advocate for myself. She reminded me that accepting help wasn't the same as becoming dependent, but I needed to maintain my own decision-making and not let anyone, even family, take over my life the way Jordan had tried to control it through her sick experiment. The balance was hard to find, but Sanjay was patient, backing off when I needed space and stepping in when I genuinely needed assistance with things like getting to appointments when I felt too tired to drive. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived from the district attorney's office with a return address I didn't recognize. Inside was a handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery, the kind people use for important occasions. The letter was from Subject 3's parents, and my hands started shaking before I even finished reading the first paragraph. They wrote about their son, about how they'd believed for over a year that his death was just a terrible consequence of his heart condition, something they'd been preparing for but hoping wouldn't come so soon. Learning the truth about what Jordan had done, that their son's death wasn't natural at all, but the result of someone deliberately withholding his medications, had reopened their grief in ways they were still processing. But they wanted me to know they were grateful. The truth was finally coming out, that other families wouldn't have to wonder like they had, and they offered their support for my recovery in any way I might need. Reading their words about losing their child made everything feel heavier, like the weight of Subject 3's death was something I was carrying too, even though I knew logically that Jordan's actions weren't my fault. But it reinforced that pursuing justice through the criminal case was the right choice, that this wasn't just about my own recovery, but about making sure Jordan faced consequences for every person she'd hurt. I showed the letter to Sanjay that evening, and he read it carefully before folding it back into the envelope. He didn't say much, just pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than usual. The university finally released a public statement about the case after the student newspaper had been running articles for weeks, pressuring the administration to address how Jordan had been able to operate for so long without anyone noticing. The statement showed up on the university website and in an email to all students and staff, carefully worded by lawyers to express concern and sympathy without admitting any actual fault or liability. It talked about the seriousness of the allegations, the university's commitment to student safety, and their full cooperation with law enforcement, but there was no mention of Jordan's professor or his role in encouraging her research. Within hours of the statement going live, student activists organized a protest outside the administration building, demanding more transparency and real accountability for the oversight failures that had allowed Jordan to conduct illegal experiments on multiple roommates over several years. Sanjay showed me photos from the protest on social media that evening, dozens of students holding signs about protecting vulnerable students and demanding answers about the professor's involvement. The activism felt validating, like other people understood that this wasn't just about one disturbed student, but about institutional failures that needed to be addressed. My insurance company started pushing back on covering the extended plasmapheresis treatments around the same time, sending letters claiming the therapy was experimental for my type of rejection and not medically necessary. Dr. Garcia spent hours on the phone with their medical reviewers, doing what she called peer-to-peer calls, explaining my case in detail and providing research articles supporting the treatment approach. The insurance company kept asking for more documentation, more justification, more proof that the treatments were helping. Vanessa got involved too, helping me file formal appeals and gather letters from other transplant specialists supporting Dr. Garcia's treatment plan. The whole bureaucratic fight added stress when I was trying to focus on physical recovery, having to worry about whether the next treatment would be covered or if I'd be stuck with bills I couldn't afford. Dr. Garcia assured me she wouldn't stop the treatments regardless of insurance approval, that we'd figure out the financial piece later. But I hated feeling like my health was decided by people in an office somewhere who'd never met me and didn't understand what Jordan had done. Cleo called one evening to ask if I wanted to meet the family of Subject 2, the person with epilepsy, whose seizure medications Jordan had replaced. They lived about an hour away and were pursuing a civil lawsuit against both Jordan and the university, and their attorney thought I should consider joining the case. I wasn't sure I had the energy for both criminal and civil proceedings, especially with everything else happening, but Cleo said meeting them might help me decide. We met at a coffee shop the following Saturday, and Subject 2's mother gripped my hand so tightly when we were introduced that I could feel her desperation for connection with someone who understood. Her daughter had survived the medication tampering, but still dealt with increased seizure frequency and had developed anxiety around taking any medications, checking and rechecking every pill before swallowing it. Their attorney laid out the civil case, explaining how it was separate from the criminal prosecution and focused on financial damages and institutional accountability rather than criminal punishment. He talked about medical expenses, pain and suffering, future care needs, and the university's failure to properly supervise student research activities despite warning signs. I told them I'd think about it and consult with their lawyer, even though part of me wondered if I could handle one more legal process on top of everything else. The preliminary hearing arrived on a cold morning in late October, almost 4 months after the initial crisis. I'd been preparing with ADA McPherson for weeks, but actually walking into the courtroom and seeing Jordan sitting at the defense table made my stomach twist. She looked smaller somehow, less threatening than the person who'd systematically poisoned me, but her expression was the same cold detachment I remembered from that day by the ambulance. The hearing took most of the day as the prosecution presented evidence to establish probable cause for trial. I testified about discovering the switched medications, finding the laptop and victim files, my medical crisis and ongoing kidney damage. Jordan's defense attorney tried to suggest during cross-examination that I might have been confused about my medications due to side effects of immunosuppression, that maybe I'd been taking them irregularly on my own. But Ada McPherson had prepared me for this, and I stayed calm, sticking to the facts about the sugar pills, the surveillance footage, Jordan's own documentation spelling out exactly what she'd done. The prosecutor walked the judge through the laptop files systematically, showing the videos of me taking the fake medications, the spreadsheets tracking my declining kidney function, the notes about other victims. By the end of the day, the judge found more than enough evidence to proceed to trial on all charges, including assault, reckless endangerment, and practicing medicine without a license, with potential murder charges still being developed for Subject 3's death. After the hearing ended, Jordan's parents tried to approach me in the courthouse hallway as everyone was leaving. Security intervened before they got close, but I could see the woman's face clearly, streaked with tears and makeup, and the man beside her looked destroyed in a way that made me feel an unexpected flash of sympathy despite everything their daughter had done. Javier appeared at my elbow almost immediately and guided me quickly to a private room the victim services office used, shutting the door firmly behind us. He reminded me that I wasn't responsible for their pain, that their daughter's choices had caused this situation for everyone, including them, and that I didn't owe them any interaction or explanation. I knew he was right, but seeing their faces had shaken me more than I expected, a reminder that Jordan's actions had destroyed multiple families in different ways. Dr. Garcia ordered another kidney biopsy 4 months after the initial crisis to get a clear picture of the long-term damage. The procedure was just as uncomfortable as the first time, lying still while they inserted the needle through my back to extract tissue samples, but at least I knew what to expect this time. The results came back showing chronic changes consistent with previous rejection episodes, scarring and damage that would be permanent, but no active acute rejection happening currently. Dr. Garcia explained it in terms I could understand, that my kidney had basically aged faster than it should have, like adding years of wear in just a few months. It was functioning well enough for now at around 42%, but I'd need close monitoring for any signs of decline, and there was always a chance I might need another transplant someday if the function dropped further. The news wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it reinforced that Jordan's actions had permanently altered my health trajectory in ways I'd be dealing with for the rest of my life. The civil attorney Cleo had recommended met with me the following week to discuss the case in detail. He laid out a strong argument for damages, including all my medical expenses from the crisis and ongoing care, pain, and suffering for what I'd endured physically and emotionally, and future medical needs related to my now compromised kidney function. The university's potential liability was significant, he explained, given their failure to supervise Jordan's research activities despite warning signs and their professor's involvement in funding her work. He walked me through previous cases involving institutional negligence and student harm, showing me settlement amounts that made my head spin. I decided to join the civil suit, viewing it as another form of holding people accountable beyond just the criminal case, a way to make sure the university faced consequences for the oversight failures that had enabled Jordan to hurt so many people. Detective Bradshaw called with an update about the investigation into Jordan's professor. The university had completed their internal review and found him guilty of research misconduct, violating ethical guidelines, and failing to properly supervise student research. He'd been terminated from his position effective immediately and would lose his tenure. However, he wouldn't face criminal charges because his emails had been carefully worded to maintain what lawyers called plausible deniability, encouraging Jordan's work without explicitly acknowledging the illegal human experimentation. His academic career was effectively over, though, Detective Bradshaw assured me, since the misconduct findings would follow him and no reputable institution would hire him. The university was also conducting a broader review of their research oversight procedures to prevent anything like this from happening again, though I suspected that review was motivated more by liability concerns than genuine commitment to student safety. 5 months felt like both forever and no time at all when I walked back into my office building for the first time since everything happened. My manager had set me up with a part-time schedule that worked around my twice-weekly doctor appointments and the frequent blood draws I needed to monitor my kidney function. The building looked exactly the same, but I felt completely different walking through those doors. My coworkers were kind and careful around me, asking how I was doing with these concerned expressions that made me want to disappear. I settled into my desk and opened my laptop, staring at the screen while my brain refused to process the simplest tasks. The immunosuppression drugs kept my body from attacking my kidney, but they also made everything feel slow and foggy, like I was thinking through thick cotton. I'd read the same email 3 times before realizing I hadn't actually absorbed any of the words. By lunch, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the actual work I'd done. Paulina had warned me about this during our session the week before, explaining that my expectations needed to match my current reality instead of comparing myself to who I used to be. I kept thinking about how I used to handle complex projects and tight deadlines without breaking a sweat, and now I struggled to focus on basic correspondence for more than 20 minutes at a time. The fatigue wasn't just physical tiredness that sleep could fix. It was this bone-deep exhaustion that made even thinking feel like running through mud. I made it through 3 hours before admitting I needed to go home and rest. My phone rang 2 days later while I was attempting to work through another foggy afternoon. The screen showed Ada McPherson's number, and I answered immediately, my heart suddenly racing. She got straight to the point in that efficient way she had. The medical examiner had completed a thorough review of Subject 3's case, using all the evidence from Jordan's files. They'd ruled his death a homicide based on the documentation showing deliberate medication withholding that directly caused his cardiac arrest. The district attorney's office was adding charges of second-degree murder and manslaughter to Jordan's case. McPherson explained that these charges carried significantly heavier sentences than the assault and endangerment charges already filed. If convicted on all counts, Jordan could face decades in prison instead of just years. I sat there processing this information while my hands shook slightly. Subject 3 had a name now, Danny Waters, and his death was officially recognized as murder instead of natural causes from his heart condition. McPherson said the upgraded charges changed the entire scope of the prosecution, and she wanted me to know before it hit the news. I thanked her and ended the call, then sat staring at my computer screen without seeing it. Danny Waters' family would finally have acknowledgement that their son's death wasn't just tragic bad luck, but deliberate harm. The new murder charges triggered immediate activity from Jordan's defense attorney. McPherson called again 3 days later to say they'd reached out about a possible plea deal. She was consulting with all the victims before responding to any offer, because this decision affected everyone Jordan had harmed. I met with Cleo and the family members of the other victims at the district attorney's office the following week. We sat around a conference table while McPherson laid out what a plea deal might look like versus taking the case to trial. Jordan's attorney was suggesting a deal that would involve pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a lighter sentence, probably 15 to 20 years, instead of the potential life sentence the murder charge carried. McPherson walked us through the pros and cons with careful honesty. A plea deal would spare us the trauma of testifying and guarantee a conviction, but it would also let Jordan avoid full accountability for what she'd done. A trial meant we'd have to face her in court and relive everything publicly, but it also meant the full scope of her crimes would be documented in the legal record. We went around the table sharing our thoughts. Cleo spoke first, saying she wanted a trial because accepting a plea felt like letting Jordan minimize the severity of what she'd done to multiple people over several years. Danny Waters' mother agreed, her voice shaking as she explained that her son deserved full justice. Subject 2's family felt the same way. When it came to my turn, I thought about all the evidence we had and how strong the case was. The surveillance footage, the detailed documentation, the sugar pills, the professor's emails, my hospitalization records, everything pointed to calculated, deliberate harm. I told McPherson I wanted to go to trial. She nodded and made notes, then looked around the table at all of us. The decision was unanimous. She'd informed Jordan's attorney that we were rejecting any plea negotiations and moving forward with a full trial. 2 weeks after that meeting, I woke up with a burning sensation when I used the bathroom. By afternoon, the burning had intensified and I was running a low fever. I knew immediately what was happening because I'd dealt with urinary tract infections before my transplant. But now, with my compromised kidney function and suppressed immune system, even a simple UTI could become dangerous. I called Dr. Garcia's office and they told me to come in right away. She examined me and ran a urine culture, her expression serious as she reviewed my symptoms. My temperature had climbed to 101 degrees by the time she got the preliminary results, showing a significant bacterial infection. She admitted me to the hospital that evening for intravenous antibiotics because oral medications might not work fast enough with my weakened immune system. The infection triggered inflammation throughout my urinary tract, and my kidney responded by struggling. My creatinine levels started climbing within 24 hours, jumping from the baseline of 2, one that I'd maintained since the rejection crisis, to 2.8 by the second day. Dr. Garcia increased my antibiotic doses and added additional medications to support my kidney function while we fought the infection. I spent 5 days in the hospital watching my numbers slowly improve as the antibiotics did their work. The creatinine didn't drop back to baseline, though. It stabilized at 2.3, slightly higher than before the infection, and stayed there even after I was discharged. Dr. Garcia explained that the infection had caused additional stress to an already compromised kidney, resulting in a small permanent decrease in function. I was down to about 38% kidney function now, instead of the 42% I'd had before the UTI. She scheduled more frequent monitoring appointments and adjusted my medication regimen again. The whole experience reinforced how precarious my health situation was now. A simple infection that most people could treat with a few days of oral antibiotics had nearly triggered another crisis for me. Every illness, every infection, every stressor to my body carried higher stakes because my kidney was operating with so little reserve capacity. I couldn't stop thinking about how different my life would be right now if Jordan had never touched my medications. Cleo called me the week after I got out of the hospital with an idea she'd been developing. She'd been researching policies at other universities regarding medication storage and roommate screening for students with chronic health conditions. Most schools had virtually no protections in place beyond generic housing agreements that didn't address medical vulnerabilities. She wanted to advocate for policy changes that would require secure medication storage options for students who needed them, and better screening processes to identify potential risks when placing roommates. I agreed immediately, grateful to channel my anger and frustration into something productive. We started by requesting meetings with university administrators and student government representatives. The first meeting happened in a conference room in the administrative building with Lewis Porter and 2 other housing officials. Cleo and I had prepared a presentation outlining specific policy recommendations. We suggested requiring lockable medication safes in rooms for students with chronic conditions, implementing background checks that included prior disciplinary actions for roommates with access to others' medical information, and creating a reporting system for concerning behaviors related to medication or health monitoring. The administrators listened politely and took notes, but their responses were frustratingly vague. They talked about feasibility studies and committee reviews and budget considerations. Lewis Porter was more direct, acknowledging that the current system had failed to protect students and changes were needed. We left that meeting feeling like we'd made some impact, but knowing it would be a long process to actually implement meaningful changes. Our next meeting with student government went better. The student representatives were engaged and supportive, several of them sharing stories about friends or roommates with chronic conditions who'd experienced boundary violations or medication theft. They committed to drafting a resolution supporting our proposed policies and presenting it at their next General Assembly meeting. The activism gave both Cleo and me a sense of purpose that extended beyond our own recovery. We were working to prevent what happened to us from happening to other vulnerable students. 6 months after the initial crisis, McPherson called with the trial date. The case was scheduled to begin in 3 months, giving us the summer to prepare. She wanted to start intensive preparation sessions with all the victims who would be testifying. The first session happened at her office on a Tuesday afternoon. Cleo and I sat with Danny Waters' parents and Subject 2's family, while McPherson walked us through what to expect in court. She explained the structure of the trial, the types of questions we'd face during direct examination and cross-examination, and the importance of staying calm and focused on the facts, even when the defense attorney tried to rattle us. She had us practice answering difficult questions, pushing us to respond clearly and specifically without getting defensive or emotional. The defense would likely try to suggest we were unreliable witnesses, that our memories were affected by medications or medical conditions, that we had financial motivations for exaggerating our experiences. McPherson coached us on how to counter these tactics by sticking to documented facts and staying centered in our own truth. We'd be meeting every week for the next 3 months to continue preparing. The approaching trial felt both necessary and overwhelming. Part of me wanted to face Jordan and make her hear about the harm she'd caused. Another part of me dreaded being in the same room with her again, having to relive the worst experience of my life while she sat there watching. McPherson assured us that she'd be with us every step of the way, and that we'd be ready when the time came. Sanjay and I were cooking dinner together one evening when he brought up something that had been on his mind. We'd been living together for months now and had fallen into comfortable routines, but he wanted to talk about how this experience had changed him. He admitted that before all this happened, he'd been coasting through life without thinking much about what really mattered. He'd been focused on his career and social life in this surface-level way that felt hollow now. Watching me nearly die and then struggle through months of recovery had forced him to reevaluate his priorities. He'd started volunteering at a patient advocacy organization and was considering going back to the school for a degree in social work. He wanted to help people navigate medical crises the way Javier had helped me. I told him I was grateful that something positive had come from such a terrible situation and that I was proud of him for turning his empathy into action. We talked about family responsibility and how trauma changes people in ways both destructive and constructive. Sanjay said he'd always seen me as the older brother who had everything figured out, and now he understood that nobody really has it all figured out, and that's okay. We were both just doing our best to move forward and find meaning in the chaos. These honest conversations deepened our relationship in ways I hadn't expected. We weren't just brothers anymore, but genuine friends who'd been through something profound together. The civil case against the university moved forward on a separate track from the criminal trial. My attorney scheduled depositions with various university officials, including the housing director, the biochemistry department chair, and the dean of students. I sat in a conference room across from each administrator while they gave carefully worded answers designed to minimize institutional liability. They claimed they had no way of knowing about Jordan's activities, that student privacy laws prevented them from monitoring research projects too closely, that the professors' involvement was outside their oversight capacity. Reading their evasive responses made my blood pressure rise. These were the people responsible for student safety, and they were more concerned with protecting the university from lawsuits than acknowledging their failures. The housing director couldn't explain why there were no protocols for students with chronic conditions who might be vulnerable to roommate exploitation. The department chair insisted the professor's research oversight was adequate, despite evidence of misconduct. The dean kept referring questions to the legal team. My attorney remained calm throughout, taking detailed notes and occasionally pressing harder on specific points. After the depositions ended, he assured me that the documentation of their negligence was building a strong case for settlement. The university's lawyers had to know they were in a weak position given the criminal case evidence and the clear pattern of institutional failures. He expected them to offer a settlement before the criminal trial concluded because they wouldn't want the civil case playing out in public while media attention was focused on Jordan's prosecution. My therapy sessions with Paulina had evolved beyond just processing the immediate trauma. She'd started helping me work through more complicated feelings about Jordan that went beyond simple anger and betrayal. I found myself thinking about how someone becomes radicalized enough to justify killing people in the name of proving a conspiracy theory. Jordan had been a normal college student at some point, before she fell down the rabbit hole of medical conspiracy theories and anti-pharmaceutical propaganda. Something had happened to twist her thinking until she genuinely believed she was conducting important research rather than committing murder. I told Paulina I was disturbed by the question of what intervention might have prevented Jordan from reaching that point. If someone had noticed her increasingly extreme views and gotten her help earlier, would Danny Waters still be alive? Would I still have full kidney function? Paulina helped me understand that while these questions were natural, I couldn't take responsibility for Jordan's choices or blame myself for not seeing warning signs earlier. Jordan had made deliberate decisions to harm people and had hidden those decisions carefully. Processing these nuanced emotions was harder than just staying angry. Anger was clean and simple. Understanding was messy and uncomfortable. But Paulina insisted that working through the complexity was important for my long-term healing. I needed to see Jordan as a whole person who'd done terrible things rather than reducing her to a monster, because that fuller understanding would help me make sense of what happened and move forward. Detective Bradshaw requested a final meeting 9 months after he'd first responded to my hospital room. He arrived at my apartment with a thick folder containing his complete investigation report. He'd spent the better part of a year documenting every aspect of Jordan's crimes across multiple victims and several years. The report detailed the surveillance operation, the medication tampering methods, the online radicalization process, the professor's involvement, and the full timeline of events for each victim. He walked me through the key findings, explaining how the investigation had uncovered evidence connecting Jordan to at least 6 potential victims beyond the 4 confirmed cases. The additional victims had experienced suspicious health issues while living with Jordan, but lacked the kind of documentation that existed for me, Cleo, Subject 2, and Danny. Bradshaw told me privately that this case would stay with him because of how calculated and cold-blooded the abuse had been. He'd worked plenty of violent crimes during his career, but something about Jordan's systematic approach and scientific detachment was particularly chilling. She'd documented people suffering with the same dispassion someone might use to record data in a chemistry experiment. He promised to be present throughout the trial to support all the victims and to make sure Jordan faced full accountability for what she'd done. I thanked him for his thorough work and his commitment to seeing the case through to the end. The investigation was officially closed now, with all evidence compiled and ready for trial. The next phase would be presenting everything to a jury and letting them decide Jordan's fate. As the trial date approached, I started looking at apartments with Sanjay's help, because living independently again felt important for my recovery, even though the idea scared me. We spent weekends touring buildings until we found a place with good security features, including a doorman who checked IDs and locked entry doors with cameras in the hallways. The apartment was small, but had a bedroom I could make my own and a kitchen where I could manage my medications privately. Sanjay helped me move my belongings from storage and set up the medication safe in my bathroom, the same kind of lockbox I never thought I'd need before Jordan. We established a routine where he came over for dinner 3 or 4 times a week, and having that regular connection helped me feel less isolated while still maintaining my independence. The first night alone in my new place, I barely slept, checking the locks repeatedly and listening to every sound in the hallway. But gradually, the space started feeling like mine, rather than just a place I was hiding. The trial began on a cold morning in early March, exactly 7 months after Jordan had first replaced my medications with sugar pills. The courthouse steps were crowded with news cameras and reporters trying to get statements from anyone connected to the case. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly with victims' families, university representatives trying to look concerned, and dozens of people I didn't recognize who'd followed the case in the media. I sat in the front row with Cleo and Subject 2's mother, all of us there to watch justice hopefully happen. When they brought Jordan in wearing an orange jumpsuit with her hands cuffed in front of her, I felt my stomach drop, because this was the first time I'd seen her in person since the paramedics loaded me into the ambulance. She looked smaller than I remembered, almost fragile, definitely not the monster I'd built up in my mind over the past months. But when she scanned the courtroom and her eyes passed over me, there was still that same cold detachment I'd seen when she admitted what she'd done, like she was observing specimens rather than looking at people whose lives she'd destroyed. My testimony started that afternoon and stretched across 2 full days, because Ada McPherson walked me through every single detail of discovering the tampering. I described finding the sugar pills in Jordan's sock drawer, the surveillance equipment recording my every move, the folders documenting 3 other victims with clinical precision. McPherson had me explain my medical history, how the transplant had given me 3 years of normal life, how I'd trusted Jordan completely as my roommate and friend. The jury took notes while I talked about the increasing fatigue, the back pain returning, the moment I realized someone had been systematically poisoning me. Jordan's defense attorney tried to rattle me during cross-examination, suggesting I'd been confused about my medications because of the side effects of immunosuppression, implying I might have taken double doses myself and forgotten. I stayed focused on the facts, describing the exact weights of the bottles, the sugar powder I'd tasted, the spreadsheets tracking my decline with timestamps and detailed observations. When McPherson asked me to read aloud from Subject 3's folder, specifically the entry that said, "Cardiac arrest achieved on day 73. Subject expired before emergency services arrived," I watched several jurors' faces change from professional attention to visible disturbance. One woman in the back row covered her mouth with her hand, and another juror shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. And I knew they understood this wasn't just about medication errors or roommate conflicts, but about deliberate, calculated harm. Cleo took the stand next, and her testimony hit even harder than mine because she'd come so close to dying. She described the increasing confusion and fatigue as her blood sugar climbed without proper insulin, the day she collapsed at work and woke up in the ICU with doctors telling her she'd been in diabetic ketoacidosis. For months afterward, medical teams couldn't figure out why her insulin wasn't working until they finally tested it and discovered it had been replaced with saline. She explained the terror of not being able to trust her own body or her medications, the way Jordan had played the concerned roommate the entire time while documenting her deterioration. Subject 2's mother testified about her daughter's increased seizures, the hospitalizations, the brain damage from prolonged episodes that could have been prevented with proper medication. The prosecution built a devastating picture across multiple witnesses, showing how Jordan had operated the same way with each victim over several years, always choosing roommates with serious medical conditions, always replacing their medications while pretending to care, always documenting their suffering with scientific detachment. The medical experts came next, and their testimony made the permanent harm crystal clear. Dr. Garcia took the stand and explained my kidney function in detail, how 2 months without proper immunosuppression had triggered acute rejection that caused lasting damage. She told the jury my function might never fully recover to what it had been before Jordan's tampering, how I now faced increased risk of needing another transplant in the future, how I'd gone from living a relatively normal life to managing chronic kidney disease again. The jury paid close attention as she described the permanent scarring visible in my biopsy results, the antibodies my body had created against the transplant, the aggressive treatments required to stop the rejection process. Other medical experts testified about the harm done to Cleo and Subject 2, about how medication tampering could cause irreversible damage even if the victim survived, about how each day without proper medication increased the risk of permanent complications or death. Subject 3's parents testified near the end of the prosecution's case, and their grief filled the entire courtroom. His mother described losing her son at 24 years old, how they'd thought his death was from his pre-existing heart condition, how learning the truth months later had reopened all that pain with the added horror of knowing it was deliberate. His father's voice shook as he explained finding out someone had documented their son's death as an achievement, as data for a thesis, as proof of a theory about medication dependence. Their testimony was raw and painful, and even Jordan's defense attorney seemed subdued during cross-examination, asking only a few gentle questions before letting them step down. Ada McPherson rested the prosecution's case with that testimony still hanging in the air, and I could see from the jurors' faces that the evidence had built exactly the devastating picture she'd intended. After 3 weeks of trial that felt both endless and too fast, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before the bailiff announced they'd reached a verdict. We all filed back into the courtroom with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The judge asked the foreperson to read the verdicts, and one by one they came back guilty on every single count, including second-degree murder for Subject 3's death, assault for the harm to me and the other survivors, reckless endangerment, and practicing medicine without a license. The courtroom erupted in quiet tears and relieved embraces as people processed what they'd heard. Cleo grabbed my hand, and Subject 2's mother hugged her daughter who'd come to hear the verdict. Jordan showed absolutely no emotion as the bailiff led her away, her face as blank and detached as it had been throughout the entire trial, and I felt this complicated mixture of relief and sadness and complete exhaustion wash over me all at once. The sentencing hearing happened 2 months later in the same courtroom. The judge reviewed the case details and the pre-sentence investigation report before imposing 40 years to life in prison with possibility of parole after 25 years. Ada McPherson delivered a statement about the calculated nature of Jordan's crimes and the need to protect society from someone who viewed human life as experimental data rather than as people deserving care and dignity. All the victims were given the opportunity to deliver impact statements, and I spoke about reclaiming my life despite the permanent harm done, about learning to trust again, about the daily reality of managing chronic kidney disease because of choices Jordan made. Cleo spoke about her ongoing trauma, and Subject 2's mother spoke about her daughter's continued struggles. Subject 3's parents spoke last about the hole in their family that would never heal. The judge listened to everything before explaining his reasoning for the sentence, emphasizing that Jordan had shown no remorse and had endangered countless lives through her actions. 1 year after the crisis that started with missing medications and ended with discovering Jordan's horrifying experiments, my kidney function stabilized at 40%, and I learned to manage life with chronic kidney disease again. The civil case settled with the university paying substantial damages that would cover my future medical needs, including the possibility of another transplant if my function declined further. I continued therapy with Paulina every other week, working through the complicated feelings about trust and safety and what it meant to rebuild after such a profound betrayal. Cleo and I stayed close, texting almost daily and meeting up monthly to check in on each other's recovery. Subject 2's family invited me to a support group they'd started for victims of medical abuse, and I found purpose in advocating for better protections and oversight in shared housing situations. Sanjay and I were closer than ever. Our relationship deepened by going through the worst together and coming out the other side. My life looked completely different from it had before Jordan. Smaller in some ways with more medical appointments and restrictions, but also richer with this community of survivors who understood what I'd been through. The kidney transplant that was supposed to give me freedom now required constant vigilance with frequent labs and careful medication management, but I was alive and safe and determined to make the most of every day I had with this hard-won stability. Some mornings I still checked my medication bottles twice to make sure the pills looked right, and some nights I still had dreams about finding those folders in Jordan's drawer. But I'd built something meaningful from the wreckage, including stronger boundaries, deeper friendships, and the knowledge that I could survive even the most profound violation of trust and come out the other side still standing. That's all I've got for today. Honestly, I didn't expect you to make it this far. But since you did, you might as well subscribe and see how weird it gets next time.